Welcome, everyone. My name is Hamid Tehrani. I'm the Director of Communications here at the college, and it's my honor to introduce our tonight's speaker, Professor Peter Adamson, who is going to talk about the greatest philosopher you have never heard of, i.e. Fakhr al-Dīn al-Rāzī. About the lecture that he's going to deliver. Would you please mute your microphone because this is being recorded? Okay, so alongside such famous names in Islamic philosophy, for example, al-Fārābī, Ibn Sīnā, or Avicenna in the Europeanized way of referring to him, Ibn Rushd or Averroes, the tradition has many other outstanding thinkers who are little known in the Western world. One of them is Fakhr al-Dīn al-Rāzī, who died early in the 13th century Common Era. In this paper, Professor Adamson will present a few of his most intriguing ideas about God, space, and time, and the difference between humans and animals. A few words about Professor Adamson, our presenter today. Professor Peter Adamson is professor of late ancient and Arabic philosophy at LMU in Munich. He is the author of Al-Kindi and Al-Razi in the series Great Medieval Thinkers from Oxford University Press, and has edited or co-edited many books, including the Cambridge Companion to Arabic Philosophy and Interpreting Avicenna Critical Essays. He is also the host of the popular podcast called History of Philosophy. The URL is www.historyofphilosophy.net, which appears as a series of books with Oxford University Press. Without further ado, may I ask Professor Adamson to start his presentation? Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm glad that you can join me tonight to talk about or hear about Fakhr al-Dīn al-Rāzī, and I will share my screen with you, which hopefully will work. So hopefully that looks okay. Can someone confirm to me you can all see it?
Looks fine.
Okay, great. Okay, so actually that kind introduction sort of captured what I wanted to say at the beginning as well, which is that there's a handful of well-known philosophers from the Islamic world who you probably will all have heard of. Probably the most well-known are first Ibn Sīnā, or Avicenna, as he's called in English, because that's what he was called in Latin, and Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, as he was called in Latin. The reason why the two of them are particularly famous is, first of all, that they were very important in their own right, also in the Islamic world. As we're going to be seeing, Ibn Sīnā in particular was very influential in the Islamic world. But then secondly, also because they were very influential in the Latin-speaking world, so in Latin Christendom, and they influenced medieval philosophers like Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus and so on. So they've come to be pretty famous in the European language traditions, to the point where most people who have come across anything about medieval philosophy will have heard of them. But there are many philosophers, as we just heard in the introduction, in the Islamic world who aren't so famous. And that's usually because, at least not so famous in Europe. So the person I'm going to be talking about now, Fakhr al-Dīn al-Rāzī, is pretty well known, for example, in Iran, because he's from Iran. But in Europe, these people are not famous for various reasons. And the usual reason, which applies to him, is that they lived a little bit too late for their works to be translated into Latin. So he dies in the early 13th century, and he's living in Iran and Central Asia, as I'll say in a minute, which means that he lives around the time that the translation movement from Arabic into Latin is happening. So this is around the time that the works of Ibn Sīnā and Ibn Rushd are being translated. That happens at the end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th century. So just around the time that he's dying, or an old man and then dying. But he lives really far east, right? So he's in Central Asia, he's in Iran, and his works just don't make it to the West in time to be involved in this translation movement. It's an interesting question whether they would even have been interested in him, because as you'll see, he's not that focused on the idea of responding to Aristotle. He's responding to Ibn Sina, not Aristotle. That's an important fact that we'll get back to. But anyway, the upshot of this is that in general, he's not a name to conjure with in the European language traditions. But actually, he's getting a lot of attention now from scholars like me and other colleagues of mine who are increasingly working on something that we sometimes call post-Avicennan philosophy, or even post-classical philosophy. And we're using this phrase to describe a very striking phenomenon in the Islamic world. It's especially true of the Islamic East, by which I actually mean most of the Islamic world. So not so much Islamic Spain or Northern Africa, not the Maghreb, but everything from Syria over to modern day Afghanistan. And in these regions, you have generations of thinkers who are very interested in Avicenna or Ibn Sina's thought and are writing very detailed philosophical / theological works that respond to him. And they take a variety of positions on him. So some are completely critical, and the one who's most famous for this is Al-Ghazali. I'll say more about him in a second. And again, he's probably a name you've all heard before because he's such an important figure in the history of Islamic religion. So some people are very critical of him. There are other critics like al-Masudi, for example, or Shahrastani is very critical of him. But then there are other people who are very interested in defending him, like Nasiruddin at-Tusi, who again I'll get to in a second. Razi is interesting because he's kind of in the middle. So he's got a very nuanced approach to Ibn Sina. Broadly speaking, I think he's usually seen more as a critic than a defender of Ibn Sina, but he really has a deep understanding of Ibn Sina's philosophy, and he understands why Ibn Sina defends the various positions that he defends. So it's when he's doing a criticism of Ibn Sina's thought, you might call it an immanent critique. So he's basically criticizing it from the inside, as it were. Like I say, with a very deep understanding of what Ibn Sina was trying to do. And also sometimes using Ibn Sina's ideas against him. And we're going to see an example of that towards the end of the talk. One challenge of the philosophical / theological literature in this period is that there's a lot of it. So there's a kind of irony here, which is that you often hear that philosophy kind of ended around the 12th century or declined basically after the time of Ibn Rushd. And that for whatever reason, like because Islamic culture was overtaken by mysticism, or because the Mongols showed up and killed all the scholars, or whatever the reason would be, there's this long-standing idea that basically philosophy ends around the end of the 12th century in the Islamic world. Ibn Rushd died in 1198. So even now, even though nobody who's serious who works in the field now thinks that this is true, you will still see it a lot in popular presentations of the history of philosophy. But actually, not only is it not true, but we in fact have the opposite problem, which is there's so much philosophical writing that we can't even come to grips with it because there's too much. I'll later at the end of the talk, I'll introduce to you a project I've been involved in, which is sort of a first step in that direction. But especially once you get past like the 12th, 13th century, so the first couple of 100 years after Ibn Sina, he died in 1037. So once you get past the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, there's just many, many figures working in philosophy who haven't really been studied yet. So we're talking about authors whose works have not been edited. In other words, they still only exist in manuscript. We're talking about authors whose works have been edited maybe, but haven't been studied. Some of them have been studied in Persian and Arabic, but not in European languages. So there's a lot to do still. And also, not only are there many of these authors, but they have a tendency to write very long books. Fakhr al-Dīn is not an exception. I'm going to be quoting a lot from a book called Matalib al-Aliyah, which means something like exalted topics of inquiry. which in the printed volumes that we use, the edition, is 7 volumes long. You're looking here at a picture of his tafsir, so his commentary, his appropriately named Tafsir Kabir, so the great commentary on the Quran. And you can see here actually that this picture only starts with volume 3, right? So I only gave you the part with his name on it. But it's, I think, something like 12 volumes. So it's a huge piece of commentary. So lots to do, lots to read. We're only getting started. So I'm only kind of telling you the fruits of our initial researches into this period. But it has to be said that among all of these figures, once you get past Ghazali, who's very well studied, Fakhr al-Dīn al-Rāzī is probably the best studied figure in this period, because he's very interesting, he's very philosophically engaging. His Arabic's quite easy, actually, which is another advantage. So he's probably better studied than anyone else in the post-Ghazali era up till like really up until the time of Mullah Sadra in Iran in the early modern Safavid period. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about what's going on at this time. So effectively what's happened is that when Ibn Sina comes along, he replaces Aristotle as the most important philosopher. And both critics and defenders of falsafa, so that's obviously the Arabic word that's taken from the Greek philosophy word philosophia, so meaning philosophy. Once Ibn Sina comes along, he becomes the primary kind of figurehead who represents falsafa, and Aristotle recedes in importance even to the point where people don't read him very much anymore. There are occasional exceptions, and again, he gets more attention in the Safavid period from people like Sadra. But broadly speaking, in the period we're interested in here, so 12th, 13th, and actually also 14th and 15th and 16th centuries, there's not that much interest in reading Aristotle or other Greek works that are translated into Arabic. That's what they've been doing up till the time of Ibn Sina. So you could think about people like Al-Kindi, al-Fārābī, that's what they were doing. Once we get past Ibn Sina, with the exception of Ibn Rushd, who's still commenting on Aristotle way out in Muslim Spain, the people here in the Muslim heartlands in Iraq, Iran, Central Asia, they are all thinking about Ibn Sina. And that's why Ghazali writes a work that you've probably all heard of, which is called Tahafut al-Falasifa, usually translated as Incoherence of the Philosophers, which is a critique of Ibn Sina's philosophy. And it's really telling that he says he's attacking the philosophers, and what he means is Ibn Sina. He's not attacking Aristotle, except very indirectly. He's attacking Ibn Sina. See, that's the target. I've described Ghazali so far as a pretty harsh critic of Ibn Sina, and although he is, in fact, he said that Ibn Sina should have been put to death for being an apostate from Islam, he also actually holds on to a lot of ideas from Ibn Sina. So he thinks that Ibn Sina's logic is broadly acceptable. He also accepts a lot of Ibn Sina's natural philosophy. It's really only when Ibn Sina is talking about the nature of God, the nature of soul, God's relationship to the world, so more theologically loaded issues like that, that's when Ghazali really becomes very critical of Ibn Sina. So Ghazali is very well known. He's a very influential theologian. As I say, you've probably all heard of him. But after that, you get a series of thinkers who are less well known, I think, even in the Islamic world. So, for example, we have a Jewish Muslim convert in the 12th century named Abul Barakat al-Baghdadi, who's a very innovative thinker who actually brings in a lot of the new philosophical ideas that will also turn up in Razi. So in some ways, Fakhr al-Dīn is kind of following along in the footsteps of Abul Barakat. You have Suhrawardi, who's pretty famous because he's the father of the Ishraqi school of philosophy, which eventually becomes a big influence on Mullah Sadra. You have Fakhr al-Dīn, we'll be talking about tonight. And then you also have, for example, Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi, who dies in 1274 and is based at an astronomical observatory set up by the Mongols in Maraga. And he has a circle of scientists and philosophers around him, including the important logician Al-Khatibī, Ibn Kamuna, who's a follower of Suhrawardis, and so on. So there's a lot going on here. I obviously don't have time to get into all of the details and talk about what they were all doing. But the main point is that these guys are all responding, usually in very technical, detailed, sophisticated way, to Ibn Sina. I just want to flag briefly that this is also true of Suhrawardi. So what people usually think about Suhrawardi, so if you've heard Suhrawardi's name, you might associate him with this kind of very innovative, new, mystical type of philosophy, which is all about light and God as a light and the world receiving the illumination of God. And this is called illuminationism, so Ishraqi philosophy. That's not entirely wrong, but actually in most of his works, Suhrawardi is doing what everyone else is doing at this time. So his writings are very much like Abu Barakat's, or even closer to Fakhr al-Dīn, who had the same teacher as Suhrawardi, actually, in Al-Jili. Suhrawardi is also responding to technical issues in Ibn Sina's thought much more than he is like inventing a new way of doing philosophy. So he's not someone who is well understood in the philosophical tradition, in our opinion. But I'm not talking about Suhrawardi tonight, I'm talking about Fakhr al-Dīn. We can talk more about that at the end if you want, if you're interested in that. So I do want to talk about Fakhr al-Dīn, who died in 1210. He is from a city which was near where Tehran is now, called Rai. There are actually a lot of philosophers from Rai, and they're all called Razi. So Razi means from Rai. For example, there's the earlier doctor and philosopher about whom I've written a book, Abu Bakr al-Razi. So when it was mentioned that I wrote a book called Al-Razi, that's not about Fakhr al-Dīn, it's about the earlier one. So I've worked a lot on these two guys, both of whom are named Razi. It's a little bit confusing, but that's how it is. So he's from Rai. His father was, like him, a theologian and a jurist, and he moved around a lot. I mean, not his father, the son, Fakhr al-Dīn, moved around a lot in his life. At first as a student, where he had a particularly formative experience in the city of Nishapur, which is where he first started reading Ibn Sina and other important philosophical sources. And then, like many philosophers of this period, he's moving around from one court to another, working for various rulers under the Khwarezm Shahs and the Ghurids. The way he sort of conducts himself is that he's a real controversialist. So he actually wrote one work which is just describing the way he traveled around Central Asia and got into arguments with people. So, and apparently public arguments, so that he would sort of show up, attach himself to a court, and in the public sphere of a so-called majlis, so like a kind of situation where you have a bunch of intellectuals sitting around and talking with each other, he would get into public arguments with people and refute them. He was very impressed with his own intellect, and he was right to be impressed. So he said he was the only respectable scholar among a swarm of dimwits, which I quite enjoy. And in this work, he really describes how he met all of these different guys and made them look like idiots by refuting them. There's a very telling line towards the beginning of this work where he says that he arrived in, I forget where it is, like Isfahan or something. And he says, and there I found many people to argue with. It's like, this really like conveys what he was like. So he's very provocative, really likes this kind of back and forth of refutation. And this is the way he writes as well. So as I say, he writes a huge Quran commentary, but he also writes numerous works which have sort of similar content, where he's investigating the ideas of Ibn Sina from a broadly theological perspective, from the perspective of Asharite Kalam. So that's a school of Islamic theology that's become dominant in Sunni Islam by this point. And this way of writing is very typical of the period. So he might even be the best example, but he's certainly not the only one who's doing this. We have many, many texts by many, many authors from the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, where you have people using ideas and terminology and argument styles taken over from Kalam to talk about Ibn Sina's philosophy. This is also going together with a new kind of educational context where you have the rise of the madrasa system, which was first installed under Nizam al-Mulk back in the time of Ghazali. So this is now 100 years old, right? And these madrasas are training people in logic and other intellectual disciplines that make it easier for them to interact with philosophy. So they're thinking a lot about how does our theological tradition relate to Ibn Sina's ideas? How do Ibn Sina's ideas relate to jurisprudence? Because these are people who are almost always also scholars of law. They are using the ideas to comment on the Quran. So it's very of a kind of very fluid situation where all of these Islamic and non-Islamic disciplines are kind of mingling together. It's also maybe worth reiterating that people like Tusi were also doing astronomy. And in fact, Tusi is more famous as an astronomer than he is as a philosopher even. The way that they write is very kind of standardized in this period. Is very technical, rather dry, and takes the form of problems. So you'll have like you'll have a question like, for example, what is time? We're going to get onto that as an example later. So there'll be a section on time, right? And it will say, okay, first we have to show that time exists. Then we have to explain what time is. And then we have to consider alternative theories of what time is and refute those alternative theories. And you get lots of arguments and objections back and forth. Sometimes we don't even get a definitive answer. So this is true of Fakhr al-Dīn, for example. So sometimes he'll say, well, the question is whatever the question is, and there's people on one side and people on the other side, and these people say 18 things, and these people say 17 things, and then at the end he says, but God knows best. And he won't even tell you his own opinion. Often he does have an opinion, and his opinion when he gives it is usually very interesting. But nonetheless, I think with some justice, the philosophical literature in this period has been called, or has been said to have taken a dialectical turn. So dialectic in the sense that it's all about argument and counter-argument, and not really trying to prove things from first principles. It's more like, well, if you say this, then against you, it could be argued that something such and such. But if you make that argument, then someone else could answer such and such. So it kind of goes back and forth like that. It's much more like a debate written on the page than it is like a kind of axiomatic system of philosophy. Now, something that's striking about this is that it's a lot like Latin medieval philosophy. So if you know anything about Latin medieval philosophy, you'll know that they often write in imitation of an event that was held at the universities, which is called a disputed question, which is what it sounds like. So there'd be a question, and there'd be an open debate between like a proponent and an opponent, and the proponent would defend a thesis, and the opponent would try to attack it. And you'll get works in Latin medieval philosophy by Aquinas and others that are actually called things like disputed questions on evil or disputed questions on whatever, right? And Aquinas' Summa Theologiae is also written in this style. So here's a question, here's some viewpoints on one side of the issue, here's some viewpoints on the other side of the issue, here's what I think, and here's how I respond to all of the arguments, right? It's very similar to the way that someone like Razi would write. So the method, the writing style is very similar to Latin medieval philosophy. And also, a lot of the time, the ideas are similar. Sometimes the ideas are similar because both traditions are responding to Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, as he would have been called in Latin. So one example is that in both the Arabic/Persian tradition and the Latin tradition, there's a big debate about whether words apply to God and the world in the same sense. So if I say that God is good, and I say this ice cream cone is good, am I using the word good in the same sense? Because if I am, it looks like I'm comparing God to an ice cream cone, and that doesn't sound right. But if I'm not using the word good in the same sense, then what do I mean? I know what I mean when I call an ice cream cone good. If I'm not using that word in the same way when I apply it to God, what do I mean by it? Right? If there must be some overlap or comparison, or it doesn't make any sense to use the word for God. So there's a big debate about this in both cultures. in both cultures, you get some people saying that the words we apply to God are univocal. In other words, they have the same meaning. And actually, Fakhr al-Dīn al-Rāzī is notable for being the main defender of that view in the Islamic world. So he would say that a word like existence, and that's what they're usually arguing about in this context, is existence. The word existence, in Arabic wujud, applies to God and creatures in exactly the same sense. And then you have to additionally say that there are other differences between God and creatures. For example, God is infinite and creatures are finite. God is without a body, creatures have a body, and so on. But the idea of existence is shared between them in exactly the same sense. So when I say God exists and this ice cream cone exists, I'm using the word exists in the same way, not in two different ways or not in related ways, but that are somehow different. So he's notable for that, and it's really interesting to see the way he defends that position. It's very much like what we see among defenders of the same position in the Latin tradition. Notice, by the way, that Razi is earlier. So Razi, like I said, dies in the early 12th centuries. It's 12th century. That's a full century almost before this debate happens in Latin. So actually, in this respect, the Islamic world is ahead of the Latin-speaking world in developing both this method of writing and the debate over this particular topic. The same thing happens with the debate over how to understand the human soul. So in both Aristotle and in Sīnā, there's a way of thinking about the soul as just a kind of set of powers or faculties. Kuwan is the Arabic word. So the idea would be that what it is to have a soul is to have a whole bunch of abilities or capacities or powers like digestion, reproduction, sensation, imagination, memory, intellectual thinking, right? So all of these powers that you have taken together to have them is what it is to have a soul. And in the subsequent Arabic tradition and also in the Latin tradition, they start to get very uncomfortable with this idea and start trying to like reduce it down to just the idea of a simple soul that as one subject of awareness is able to do all of these things. So rather than thinking of the soul as a set of capacities, they think of the soul as kind of like a first person perspective on the world that can express itself in different ways, like through sensation, imagination, and thinking. Doesn't seem like a big difference, but it is a big difference metaphysically. And this is actually going to be relevant for one of the topics I want to get into in more detail, which is animals. But before I get to animals, I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about Fakhr al-Dīn's physics, just because this is something I've worked on and it's maybe surprising. I mean, often people assume that these later thinkers are really just theologians and that all they really care about is God and God's relationship to the world. But Fakhr al-Dīn is a very good philosopher and he's interested in everything. So he's interested in logic, he's interested in natural philosophy, he's interested in the soul, he's interested in anthropology, he's interested in ethics, political philosophy, law, and of course God, right? So he does the whole kind of sweep of the intellectual disciplines of his day. And so he talks at great length about time and space. He does this in several works, but the most interesting discussion, most detailed, is in his last big treatise, which is called Matalib al-Aliyah. That's what I mentioned before. And he engages with Ibn Sina's theory of both time and space in a big section of this larger work. And we're talking about, like, I don't know, maybe the whole discussion of time and space might be something like 100 pages long, if not more. It's big. Why is it so big? Well, because every time he raises a question, he says, okay, here's 12 arguments for one position. Here's 10 arguments for another position. So for example, the first thing he asks when he gets to the question of time is, well, is time even real? Is it a subjective phenomenon? Is it only in our minds? Or is it really the case that time exists out in the world? So he says, well, people disagree about this. Here's 12 proofs that time doesn't exist. And so this would be things like the past. So time has to have an extension, right? Time needs to kind of be passing, needs to have some kind of length. But the past is already over, the future isn't here yet, and the present has no length. It's just a kind of instant. so time isn't real. This is a traditional argument that goes all the way back to Aristotle. Then he says, well, okay, not only does time exist, but actually it's obvious that it exists. And kind of weirdly, he gives 10 arguments that it's obvious that it exists, which is strange, but he does it. And then he talks about time's relationship to motion, which I'll get more into in a second. Again, and you get 11 arguments about that. So it just builds up and you get this massive pile of arguments. Again, it's very typical of him to spend like 15 pages going back and forth between different arguments. And then maybe you'll get like half a page where he actually tells you what he thinks, if that. You might even only get a couple of sentences. So this is an interesting feature of philosophy in the period. It's much more about exploring an argumentative, dialectical situation than it is about promoting a certain doctrine, I think. That's especially true of Razi, but I think it's also true of other thinkers in the time. So in any case, what does he say about time? Well, he says time is real, and in some sense it's obvious that it exists, but we can kind of show that it exists and also talk about what it means to talk about time. And interestingly, this is really fascinating actually, he says, to me the most compelling view is that the truth about time and duration is the teaching of the Imam Plato, that it is subsistent through itself and essentially independent of bodies, he means. So there's a long story about why he would think this is something that has to do with Plato, but it's very interesting that he's aligning himself with Plato. Why is he doing this? Well, because he knows that Ibn Sina is a follower of Aristotle. So he's thinking, well, if I'm against Ibn Sina's view and Ibn Sina's a fan of Aristotle, then maybe I should agree with Plato, because Plato and Aristotle are these opposed classical authorities. What does he not like about the Aristotelian / Avicennan view? Well, they thought, and again, this is a long story, but to make a long story short, what they thought is that time somehow is dependent on motion. So they think that if you have a moving body, then its motion has to be somehow measured. And that measure is time. So to take an obvious example, in their astronomy, the Earth doesn't go around the sun goes around the Earth, right? So the sun goes around the Earth once per day, and a day is a unit of time, right? So in a sense, the sun is creating time by moving, because we can then measure the movements and then say, well, that's time. Time is just the measure of motion, as Aristotle defined it in his physics. And Ibn Sina accepts this definition and then builds on it and kind of works out a more elaborate theory, which is broadly Aristotelian. But the point is that time is sort of dependent on motion because it measures motion. And of course, motion is dependent on bodies. So what this means is that if there's no bodies, there would be no time, right? If there's no bodies in motion, or at least potential motion, there can't be any time. And Razi thinks this view doesn't make any sense. So for one thing, he is of the view that you could sort of imagine time passing without there being any bodies. So he gives a nice example, which is, imagine you're sitting in a dark house and so you're just kind of like in isolation, right? And nothing's happening. And he even says, imagine the person holds his breath so that he's not, sensible that his chest is going up and down. And he said, so there's no awareness of any motion or change. And then he says, this person would still be aware that time is passing. So you don't need motion to have time, he thinks. Also, if time is the measure of motion, then every time you have a motion, you'll get a different time. So for example, if the sun's going around the Earth and so is Jupiter, then we'll have one time for the sun and another time for Jupiter. But that doesn't make any sense because you don't want to have multiple times happening simultaneously. That is ridiculous. So and these are two of the many arguments he gives against this position. So again, you just get argument after argument after argument. And in the end, he concludes that time just has to be a kind of independent sort of context in which motions can happen. By the way, one issue here is that if, as I say, time is real and independent from motion, you might wonder, like, well, where did it come from? Does it necessarily exist? Like, could time not fail to exist? Has there always been time? Is it just like a permanent feature of the universe that couldn't have been otherwise? Well, that seems problematic because God is the necessary existence, time isn't. You don't want to compare something else to God and say that time is sort of just as eternal and necessary as God is. So he's not very clear on this in the Matalib, but in his commentary on the Quran, he says that God actually created time. So he thinks that God creates time, which is just kind of duration passing independently of anything else happening or any bodies existing. And then once time exists, God can create bodies, can create a world of bodies and events that are happening in time. So time is sort of like a precondition for the rest of creation. And the same is true of space. So again, he's going to criticize Ibn Sīnā and the Aristotelian tradition here. Here, it's very clear that he's doing this from the perspective of kalam, or Islamic theology. In kalam, it's traditional to say that the universe consists of atoms, so it's tiny particles that can't be divided, right? That's what atom means. It literally is something that cannot be cut in Greek. So you have atoms and they are moving around in a void space, so in emptiness, which to us actually sounds very good, right? So because we now believe that matter is atomic, we believe that there's void space, right? But this is exactly what the Aristotelians denied. So both Aristotle and Ibn Sīnā thought that void space is impossible, and they thought that there is no such thing as space, really. What there is place. So the Greek word is topos, the Arabic word is makan, as opposed to khala, which would be space or void. So makan, place, according to the Aristotelians, this is a little bit complicated, but basically what they say is the place of something is whatever is surrounding it. So for example, the place of some wine in a bottle is the bottle. And the place of the bottle is the air around the bottle. And the place of the air around the bottle is maybe the edges of the room that's holding the air. And the place of the room is the rest of the building, and the place of the building is the sky or whatever. And ultimately, the biggest place there is like the edge of the universe, right? They don't think that there's an infinite universe. They think the universe is a finite spherical body. And there's no void anywhere. So there's no empty space anywhere. All there is bodies holding each other. So like, again, to take another example, consider your own body. Your place, according to the Aristotelians, is just where the air is touching you, kind of hugging you, right? And not just the air, whatever's touching you. So like your chair. So if you're sitting down right now, the chair where it's touching your bum, that's part of the place where your body is. It's just the surrounding surface of your body. That's your place. And Razi says this can't be right. And he gives lots of arguments for it, some of which are kind of appeals to intuition. So for example, he says that if you put a precious gemstone in a bag and brought it from, I forget which cities he uses, but from one city to another. So let's say you brought it from like Baghdad to Tehran. Then even though you brought the gemstone in the bag all the way from Baghdad to Tehran, it would still be in the same place because the bag would still be surrounding it. So it wouldn't have moved, right? And that doesn't make any sense, right? So instead he says, well, there must be like a space in Baghdad and another space in Tehran, and the bag with the gemstone moves from one space to another, and that's why it's somewhere else. That's why it's moved, which for us is very intuitive, but is not what the Aristotelians would have thought. Actually, by the way, Aristotle would have said, no, the gemstone is in the same place because it's still in the bag, and the place is wherever something is in. So this is just exactly the right result. In fact, he says that explicitly. He says that if you bring like a vessel of wine, let's say, from one side of the room to another, the vessel has changed place, but the wine hasn't. And this is one reason why he thinks it's not necessary to think about space. You only need to talk about place. In addition to this, Razi gives various kind of empirical experiments and thought experiments. I'll just mention a couple to give you an idea of how he does this. So one that I really like is he says, imagine you've got two pieces of paper or two sheets, maybe sheets of metal or something. Might make more sense if they're not paper, but something stiff like metal. Okay, so now imagine that someone separates them very quickly. So when the two sheets are pulled apart, air will obviously flow into the space between them, right? So here comes the air as soon as I move my hands apart or the two sheets apart. But it takes time for air to move laterally, like from the edge of the sheet to the middle of the sheet, right? So when you pull the sheets apart, there must be this very brief moment where the air is moving in to fill the space. And until the air gets there to the middle, there must be a void. So, and if this wasn't possible, if it wasn't possible to have void, you wouldn't be able to take the sheets apart, right? Because otherwise the air would have to teleport from the edge of the sheet to the middle of the sheet to fill the space, which is a brilliant argument, actually. Like if you think about that, like, is that true? I mean, actually, I'm not even, to be honest, I'm not even sure what physics would say about that. If you had two perfect sheets, what is actually happening when you remove them? It may be that it's not a meaningful thought experiment because there's no such thing as perfect sheets of metal that have nothing in between them. But in any case, this is one argument he gives for void. Another one, which is quite nice, is take a wineskin, fill it with wine or water as full as it can get. So it's completely full, and then you close the stopper, right? And then imagine the wineskin is made of leather or something that's quite stiff. Now take a pin and poke it very gently through the wineskins, through the skin from the outside. He says it's just empirically true that you can force the tip of the needle or pin into the insides of the wineskin, and no wine comes out because the needle is blocking the hole, right? So what that means is that you have a space that's completely full, and yet you were able to get more of a body in there into the same space, namely the tip of the needle. The only way you can explain this is that there's void in amongst the particles making up the wine, and that when the needle goes in, it exploits the empty space within the wine. If the wine were completely full, then there'd be no way to get the needle in because there'd be no room for it, which is, again, a brilliant argument. And actually, I mean, I don't know about wineskins, but here he's surely right. And so you can, in fact, pack particles of a body more densely or less densely, and they take up more or less volume as a result. So these are really nice arguments, I think. And this is how he defends the reality of void against it in Sīnā. He's not the first person to give these arguments, by the way. So you find them in earlier Kalam thinkers as well, to some extent. But it's a very systematic set of arguments, and he's arguing in a very detailed way against Ibn Sina's position, which is not true of earlier Kalam thinkers. So he's really the first person to do this on this topic, I think. So I want to finish by telling you about probably my favorite topic in the Razi. This is something I've written a couple of papers about, which is what he thinks about animals, and in particular, what he thinks about animal minds. So this is actually in another one of his theological treatises called the Mulachas, and he's just been talking about the afterlife. So what happens to the soul after we die? And then he says, okay, now let's digress to think about non-human animals, because we might want to know whether they have rational souls. So, or he also used the word intellectual, so akliya. So natika, akliya. So why, he actually doesn't say this explicitly, but given the context, I think what he must be thinking is that if animals have rational intellectual souls just like we do, then they should also survive the death of their bodies like we do. And the reason he's saying that is because this is exactly Ibn Sina's view. So Ibn Sina thought that when we think, we're not using a bodily organ, And his proof of this is that you can't think about abstract universals, like general features of the world, using a particular bodily organ. You have to think about abstract things immaterially, because universals are immaterial. That's kind of the idea. It's more complicated than that, but that's basically the idea. And Ibn Sina would have said animals can't think about universals. They don't have rational souls. They don't have intellects. They just have like sensation, imagination, memory. They have all the powers that we do, which are seated in our brains, but they don't have intellect, which is this immaterial power that we have, which is outside of our brains. When we die, we are reduced to our intellective souls. So only our rational souls will survive, according to Ibn Sina. And the rest of our powers will go away. So we'll no longer have sensation, obviously, because we won't have any sense organs. But neither will we have, for example, imagination, because we won't have a brain. And imagination is seated in the brain. Since animals don't have the intellect, they only have these lower powers, like imagination, sensation, memory, and so on. Animals just die when they die. They can't survive. Okay. Now, if you thought that animals do survive and maybe can be punished in the afterlife and rewarded, which again is an idea you get a lot in Islamic theology, then there would be two ways you could argue for that, right? One is you can say, well, you don't need to have an intellectual soul in order to survive death. But the other way would be to say, well, wait a minute, maybe animals do have intellectual souls just like what we do. Maybe they're not as smart as us, but they can do the same kind of thinking we can do. Maybe they survive death just as much as we do. And it's really interesting, I think, that Fakhr al-Dīn uses the second strategy. The reason he's doing this is he's basically saying to Ibn Sina and anyone else who follows Ibn Sina, okay, for the sake of argument, I will accept your whole theory of the mind, and I will accept that only rational intellectual souls can survive the death of the body. But then I'll show you that animals have intellectual, rational souls too, and therefore they survive the death of the body. Super interesting. And then he gives a whole, again, of course, he's Razi, so he gives a whole bunch of arguments to show this, right? And I would just want to mention two of them. The first argument is that animals do grasp universals. They grasp abstract concepts. So, for example, there's famous case that Ibn Sina talks about, which is that sheep are able to perceive the hostility of a wolf that might attack them and run away. He has a whole story about how animals do this, like how the sheep would do this. And he thinks that animals have to be able to do this without grasping universals. But Razi thinks, well, if a sheep sees a wolf and runs away from it, then it must either be running away because it knows that that's a wolf, or it must be running away because it knows that it's like dangerous. But both wolf and dangerous are general ideas. They're not particular ideas. So it's not running away. It's not running because it's this wolf. Like it doesn't care which wolf it is. It only cares that it's a wolf, right? So it's running away from the wolf because it grasps the general situation, namely, I'm a sheep, that's a wolf. Sheeps are endangered by wolves, so I better get out of here, right? That's why the sheep does it. That's a really beautiful example of how Razi operates, because he's actually using Sina's example, the sheep and the wolf example, and saying, no, it proves something different. It proves that animals can perceive universals. Also, and this I love this argument, the second argument, he says, imagine that an animal performs an action, any action an animal can perform. So again, let's take the sheep running. So the sheep decides to run. So what is it deciding to do? Well, it's not deciding to perform a particular act of running, right? So I'm going to do this running, like this running that only exists here and now. What the sheep decides to do is run, a general idea, right? So what I intend to do is run. I don't intend this running. Now that's an interesting question, like whether in fact that's true, but it's pretty plausible, right? So in general, you know, if you're going to, since we just had the European Championships, and we're about to have the next installment of the English League, where Arsenal is going to win the league, I hope, this coming year. Imagine you're an Arsenal player, so you're trying to score a goal. You don't really care which goal you score, right? You're just trying to score a goal, any goal, right? So you're trying to score any particular goal that counts as a goal. So what you have in mind is a universal idea, right? So any goal. You're not trying to score one particular goal. I think that's pretty plausible, actually. And if animals work the same way, then animals must grasp universals. And then maybe the simplest case is, let's imagine an animal is looking for food, like a sheep is looking for grass to eat. Well, what it's looking for is grass, any grass. In fact, it doesn't even know about the grass that it's looking for, right? The whole point is that it's looking for grass to eat. So it's not like it's looking for one particular blade of grass or particular patch of grass. It's just looking for grass. And animals in general are looking for food in this kind of generalized way. So again, animals must grasp universals. I think these arguments are brilliant and actually pretty convincing. So this is a very good attack on Ibn Sina's philosophy. Just to go over it again and like why this matters. Ibn Sina thought that humans can think about universal, abstract, general concepts, and animals can't. Animals can only think about particular experiences that they've had or are having. And Razi says, and by the way, the reason why we live on after death and they don't is that the only part of us that lives on is the part that can do this abstract universal thinking, the intellect. And then Razi says, well, but animals can grasp universals too, otherwise they wouldn't be able to do all these things they can do. So by your own argument, animals must live on after death. That's the implication. So that's his first argument or set of arguments. I'll skip the second and third one. The fourth argument is maybe kind of simpler. He just says, well, besides, just think of all the amazing things animals do. So what about bees that build beehives and all the cells of the beehives are perfect hexagons? It's like they can do math. What about ants storing food for later? How would they do that without being able to plan? Or, and then he gives a kind of example that appears in some earlier texts as well. This is a really nice example. I don't know how true this is, but it was a story that was repeated a lot in the tradition. So supposedly it was observed that a mouse was trying to get into a bottle of oil because mice like to lick oil, right? And the oil is in a bottle that has a neck that's too thin or too narrow for the mouse to dip its head down and lick the oil. So what it does instead is it sits on top of the bottle, dips its tail into the oil, and then licks its tail. And Razi repeats this story and says, so obviously animals are rational because that's a rational plan, right? Here in the Molachas, he only gives these three cases, but in the Matalib, which is the other work I was talking about before, he gives a whole bunch of other arguments. So he talks about things like, or another example, so he talks about things like horses being able to find their way back home even when the riders can't. He talks about how animals hide from each other, hide food. He also gives examples from the so-called religious tradition. So as he says, you can take arguments from aql and naql, so both rational arguments and traditional arguments. And he talks about how there are stories about Muslim wise men who encountered speaking animals and things like that. So the upshot of it, though, is basically the same. So with all these arguments, he shows that animals are rational, they're intelligent, they have separate souls. So this means that here in around the turn of the 13th century, we have a Muslim philosopher living in Central Asia who's arguing for something that European thinkers won't be saying for many centuries, namely that animals are rational. So this is really not something you can find in Europe until maybe the Renaissance. You find some people saying it, so like 15th, 16th century. So this is really remarkable. And it's also very characteristic in that you kind of get the impression that Fakhr al-Dīn doesn't necessarily believe any of this. He's just saying, well, you could argue that animals are rational. And if you did argue that, then by the standards of Ibn Sina's philosophy, you would have to say that animals can survive death. But he's not like standing behind any of that. He's just saying, well, like here's a perfectly reasonable way of arguing. So, but you know, God knows best, right? So that's very typical. He's saying in the Sīnā's own standards of rationality and intellectual nature are such and such, let's accept those for the sake of argument, and then say that animals fulfill those criteria. Well, if so, then animals are just as rational as humans. Maybe they're not as rational, actually. Maybe they're not as like fully in command of their rational powers. And of course, there might be a continuity, like maybe dogs are smarter than mice and mice are smarter than ants and ants are smarter than worms or something. But the point is that some animals at least do display rational powers. So these are only a couple of examples. There's much more to say about Fakhr al-Dīn al-Rāzī. I've written some other things about him with one of my colleagues. We wrote the page about Fakhr al-Dīn on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which you can go check out. That's like the standard online encyclopedia of philosophy. Very good to know about in general, actually. There's a lot of pages on there about Islamic philosophy. But if you want a deeper dive, you can have a look at this book, which I also did with my colleague Fedor Benovich, which collects many passages from Fakhr al-Dīn and other authors. This is actually open access. So if you go to the website of Brill Publisher, you can actually download the whole book for free, which is kind of cool. And this it's something like 750 pages long. And we just translate a whole bunch of material from Fakhr al-Dīn and other authors of the period. This is the first of several books. There will be 3. The second one will come out later this year. So if you want to like dip into this period and learn more about it, I would humbly recommend this. I have to say, the material is not easy. So it's very sophisticated, very technical philosophy for the most part. It takes a while to get into it and learn the language and the way of thinking, but it is really fascinating. And I think that thanks to Fakhr al-Dīn and others, this so-called post-Avicennan period really is a highlight in the history of philosophy in the Islamic world. And it's something that more people should know about. It's really kind of a glory of the Islamic intellectual tradition that this happened. And I'm hoping that the work of myself and other colleagues who are doing so much more to try to bring this stuff to light will kind of get the word out that there's this very exciting period of philosophy from the Islamic world that's underappreciated. Thanks very much for your attention. Thanks for tuning in. And this is a cool picture of a horse with labels for all the parts of the horse, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming and attending this session. Somehow my shirt is reflecting the
That's very cool, actually. I want to buy that shirt.
I didn't intend it this
Tell me where you got it.
Childhood
copies.
Lutfullah Mosque in Isfahan. Let me see.
I've been there, but they weren't selling shirts like that, I have to say.
Yeah, so the recording is continuing. Before I open the floor to questions, I would like to thank Professor Adamson for a fantastic presentation. I think all of his students are blessed because he can explain intricate subjects with such ease, and I was really feeling that I'm privileged to hear his description of Fakhr al-Dīn al-Rāzī's ideas. So we're open the floor to questions. First question from Father Gelly. Please go ahead.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Well, once again, Professor Adamson's talk was fascinating. I especially want to ask a question concerning his latter part, the question of animals. In fact, it is not quite totally correct to say that in European thought, animals were never regarded as not having rationality, because Plutarch, the ancient writer Plutarch, actually wrote about the element of rationality in animals.
Mm-hmm.
He even mentions the case of courage some animals display courage, and courage being a virtue, one of the Aristotelian virtues. So that would indicate there is a kind of rationality and virtue in animals. But should I mention something very funny? This morning, before I woke up, usually they say dreams appear, manifest themselves in the latter state of your sleep. And I dreamt of two cute little dogs who spoke to me asking for food. Now, of course, that was a dream, actually. If there was any dream expert here, someone like Ibn Sirin, for example, I want to ask him what is the possible meaning of his dream. But the reason I'm mentioning this really is animals, by and large, I know the cases that people argue about dolphins on, do not have language. So would that be a big obstacle to entertaining the possibility that animals have rationality if language use is an element or a constitutive or fundamental criterion of reason?
Yes, right. Very good question. So first, just Plutarch. Sorry, the bell church bells are ringing here. Probably brought on by your question, Father Goey. So that's right. So Plutarch, and actually Plutarch is not even the most amazing example of that from late antiquity. There's an even more kind of striking work, which is by Porphyry, the Neoplatonist. And when I said the Renaissance philosophers started talking about the rationality of animals, the main reason they do that is that they were drawing on Porphyry. So you're right that actually what Fakhr al-Dīn is saying had been anticipated actually 1,000 years earlier by Plutarch and Porphyry, but then that idea kind of goes away. So you get into a long period where there's an Aristotelian orthodoxy that animals are not rational. And Fakhr al-Dīn is, as far as I know, the first person to question that since Porphyry. But you are right that it's not unprecedented, for sure. I mean, also you might think about all of the works from India where you have talking animals that help. Actually, there's a work called Kalila wa Dimna, which is translated from an Indian text, which goes into Persian and Arabic, which is full of animal fables. And that, that's sort of like your dream, right? The talking animals. And you wonder well, what's going on here? So the philosophers are all saying animals aren't rational, but the literary works are saying that animals can talk. What's going on? And I think there's an interesting question here about whether it even makes sense to ask whether, for example, in antique Indian thought, whether animals were considered as rational, because of course rationality is a very Greek notion. Which takes me to the second part of your question, which is a very good question. So actually in Greek, rational, as you probably know, is logikos. And logikos comes from the word logos, which can mean a lot of things, but among the things it can mean are reason and language. If we move to Arabic, then we have the word nautic or nutq, right? And nautic both means rational and speaking. So it's actually so nutq is a very good translation of logos, actually. It has the same ambiguity. And Razi actually talks about this in the part of the Matalib I was discussing before. He says, well, people say that animals can't talk, but they can kind of make noises that sort of communicate some kind of idea. But he doesn't do what Porphyry does, and I think Plutarch does not do this, by the way. Porphyry goes on at great length arguing that animals can talk. And he says, well, we don't understand animals when we talk, but we don't understand Persians either. And we don't think that they are not rational, right? And he says, well, they're probably communicating with each other all the time. He tells a story about a bird he had who could understand Greek because it would follow commands. And this is actually picked up in the Italian Renaissance. So there's a fantastic text which is influenced by Porphyry that where the author says that he met a dog that could speak Polish but not Italian because it belonged to a Polish family. right? So these are wonderful texts, obviously, and I mean, to some extent, it's just kind of fun to give the examples. Like the mouse with the oil is one of my all-time favorite things, actually. But I think it's important to remember that these arguments are shaped by what they're pushing against, which is an Aristotelian, also Stoic, by the way, idea that animals are non-rational because they don't, and the fact that they don't talk is seen as the best evidence that they're not rational. Also, there's a link between using language and the idea of thinking in an abstract, universal way, right? So if you're trying to convince yourself that sheep don't know what wolves are, so that they can't be running away from that thing because it's a wolf, right? Then one reason you might give is, well, sheep don't have the word for wolf. And we do. So we're able to articulate the general idea of wolf, and sheep just aren't. So it's enough for wolves to be reacting to these particular experiences they're having. Thanks, that was a great question. As you can see, I have a lot to say about it. I could go on, but I won't.
Your microphone is mute, Father Gelly. If you would like to reply, please. Okay.
I think it's done, yeah.
All right. Professor Paya, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Adamson, for a fantastic talk. Before I ask you my main question, let me put my hat as a pedant. I'm terribly sorry about that, and say something which I hope you don't mind. Just stating this because it is a common mistake among many who pronounce the name of Ghazali. Ghazali is being pronounced Ghazali, which a tashdid on Z. Ghazali is something else. And unfortunately, I have come across many authors in the West that just write Ghazali with just one Z. So this is aside.
Actually, can I ask you? That's very interesting. So,
yeah,
I mean, it's not just that people in the West sometimes write it with Z. It's like 99% of the time.
Yeah, that's
so. How do you know that?
If you go to Tus, which was the birthplace of Ghazali, or to Mashhad, or anywhere else in Iran, you would notice that people pronounce his name as Ghazali, with a tashdid on Z, not Ghazali. Okay.
So actually, my colleague Hanif is saying in the chat that Frank Griffel has a whole article about this, about how to spell Ghazali. Hanif, what does Griffel say? Does he go for? He spells it with one Z, doesn't he, Frank?
Hi, Peter. Hi, everybody. Yeah, he goes for one Z.
So he actually looks at both options and says it's no tashdid. Okay.
Yeah, but as I said,
the experts disagree. I'm agnostic. I don't have an opinion.
You can put the link in the chat, please.
Okay. The other point with regard to the notion of animals, as you said quite correctly, even Descartes was thinking that animals are not even proper living organisms. They are automata. Now, to my main question, you kindly presented an overview of Fakhr al-Dīn's philosophical approach. I would appreciate if you, for the enlightenment of all of us, say something about his approach to logic, because as you remember, Mutakallimin were against logic. And Fakhr al-Razi and Ghazali were the two who started encouraging him to use logic, because before them, many Mutakallimin were making mistakes, silly mistakes. So I would appreciate if you
okay, that's a great
comment
question.
on that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, so actually, I'm not sure. So there were certainly people who were critics of Greek logic before Ibn Sina. The best example is Sirafi, who attacked Abu Bishr Mata in this famous debate about the value of logic. And Sirafi is not a mutakallim, he's a grammarian. And I'm not actually sure that mutakallimun were, like, in general, opposed to logic. It might be better to say that, as with so many other things, they have their own logic. Like, they have their own kind of systematic way of thinking about dialectical argumentation. So that's kind of a side issue, but I think it's not so clear what to think about that. But you're absolutely right that Ghazali actually polemicizes against people who don't appreciate logic. And he says, so he does this in the Munich al-Dalal, for example, his autobiography, if you want to call it that, that people who reject logic are just being kind of intellectual troublemakers, and and you can't even take them seriously. And that, I think, partially because of that, logic becomes very widely adopted in the post-Avicennan period. And as I said, even goes into the madrasa curriculum, right? So Razi belongs to that phenomena, that sort of general tradition, and he is very interested in logic, writes a lot about it, and is very deep in the technical details of Ibn Sina's logic. So there's a lot to say about this. I think probably insofar, I mean, he's not the most important logician of the period. That would be Hunaji, who's a bit later, so he's like late 13th century. And also Katibi is also late 13th century. I think in general, it would be fair to say that the 12th century is a time where you see a lot of innovation in psychology, metaphysics, epistemology, and less so in logic, whereas the 13th century is a real high point of logic. So if you want to look at something like the logic of counterfactuals or something, so think like, in other words, truths about how things would be if the situation were different, that you'd want to look at Hunaji, not Razi, actually. But Razi has interesting things to say about some topics which for him at least would belong to logic. So a good example would be he likes Suhrawardi, has a critique of Ibn Sina's theory of definitions, where he basically says that you can't give essential definitions for anything, and when you give a definition, you're always explaining something you already understand. So the point here is that whereas the Aristotelians thought that you gained understanding by finding a definition, Suhrawardi and Fakhr al-Dīn say that you only express your opinion about something or the way you've already thought about it, your conceptual kind of framing of something, by forming it as a definition. So that would be a good example of him polemicizing against an Avicennan point in logic. But he has a lot to say about like technical details of logic too. So even like things like, you know, how does one proposition convert as another? How does the modality work? Stuff like that. So stuff that only really experts in logic would be interested in. So that's a really huge part of this whole post-Avicennan period, is their advances in logic.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor Paya. May I ask other participants to ask the question? Either raise your hand or ask the question. Go ahead and ask the question, please. All right, if there is no question, okay, there's one here. Do you see a relationship between the thought of Fakhr al-Dīn and Abu Ali Miskawayh on animals?
Yeah, actually, so as it happens, I've written a paper on Miskawayh on animals.
Mm.
So if you want to know about that, I can, actually, I've written about both of them on animals. So if anyone wants to email me about that, I can send them the papers. Okay, so again, I have a lot to say about that. So Miskawayh, maybe I should first say who Miskawayh is. So Miskawayh was a historian and literateur, like adib, who lived around the time of Ibn Sina. So he dies in 1030, I think, or 1040. So he dies around the time of Ibn Sina. And he doesn't have a dedicated discussion of animals the way that Ibn Sina has a whole section of the Shifa, his most important work, devoted to zoology, in imitation of Aristotle, who also wrote about zoology. And then Fakhr al-Dīn has these nice texts where he just talks about whether animals are rational. We don't have anything like that in Miskawayh, but with Miskawayh, you can piece together a lot of different contexts where he talks about animals. So, I mean, I found him talking about animals in probably a couple of dozen places. And so my paper is trying to bring that all together. So what I would say about him is that he does not think that animals are rational. So he's very consistent in denying that. So actually, he'd be on the Aristotelian side against Razi. But he also gives us reason to think that we should treat animals well. He even talks about showing justice towards animals, which is quite striking. And the reason he thinks that we can show justice to animals roughly is because he's an Aristotelian, not in spite of being an Aristotelian. Because what he says is that as a good Aristotelian, he thinks that animals have their own purpose and their own function that should be fulfilled if all goes well. And that if you are cruel to animals and show them injustice, you're obstructing that from you're preventing that from happening. So for example, if you kill an animal, then you're preventing it from pursuing its final end in Aristotelian terms. So that's the kind of reason he gives for showing benevolence towards animals. But he's not a vegetarian or anything. He just doesn't think that you should like mistreat animals. Maybe a more impressive predecessor of Fakhr al-Dīn al-Rāzī on this is Fakhr al-Dīn, who does talk in greater length about how you shouldn't mistreat animals. So I've written about all three of them, their views on the topic.
Question from Rizwan. Does Razi replace Ibn Sīnā as reference point in the subsequent Islamic philosophical tradition, at least amongst the Mutakallimin?
That is a great question. So for starters, that's certainly the idea. That's what he wanted. And in fact, I think there's a phenomenon happening here where people see what Ibn Sīnā did and they think, I could do that. So just as he was the new Aristotle, I'm going to become the new Ibn Sīnā. And I think Abul Barakat, Suhrawardi, and Fakhr al-Dīn al-Rāzī all were trying to do that. And I would say that Suhrawardi and Fakhr al-Dīn are to some extent successful on this. So they are absolutely crucial sources for later authors. You can even see this in something as kind of fundamental as the way people structure their works. This is something that Heidrun Eichner here in Germany, she's in Tübingen, something that she's worked on a lot, that people would actually arrange their works of philosophical theology and structure them in imitation of what Fakhr al-Dīn did, especially in the Mulakhas. So there's that. But also even you find like critics of this kind of philosophical theology like Ibn Khaldun, and it's really striking that they'll always complain about Fakhr al-Dīn as if he's like the real kind of best example of the problem. Ibn Taymiyyah was also very critical of Fakhr al-Dīn, so he was very well known. I don't think that he replaces Ibn Sīnā to the same degree, because you still do see a lot of commentaries being written on Ibn Sīnā after Razi. And in fact, I guess it's probably true that you find more commentaries being written on Ibn Sīnā, especially the Isharats, than you do on Razi. But there's no doubt that he's like a hugely important figure who just sort of gives everyone a model for how to do this kind of work later on.
Next question is, where did Fakhr al-Dīn al-Rāzī stand on Aristotelian four causes, and especially teleology, telos?
That's a great question. I think to be honest, I am not sure I know the answer to that, because to really figure out the answer to that, you'd have to look at an awful lot of material. But my impression from what I've seen is that he's pretty attracted by Asharite occasionalism. So what that would mean is that instead of thinking that things have a kind of spontaneous tendency to pursue their own final ends, it's God who's designing the world at all times. And really the question is whether he even believes in secondary causation at all. So whether he thinks that anything other than God has causal powers. I think that he does, but I think he would say that the causal powers are more like, the power to heat things up or to move, not, I don't really know of places where he talks about final causation the way that an Aristotelian would. So I think he's probably got a much kind of more reduced causal theory, the way that you would find in earlier Kalam. One thing that's very clear, though, is that he takes over this typically Avicennan way of thinking about causes, which is that a cause is something that as they say, preponderates something to happen. So the idea is that, for example, a certain body could either move or not move. And just as insofar as it's a body, either one could happen. So a cause that makes it move preponderates it to move rather than not moving, sort of like tipping a scales. And that's how he thinks about causes. So a cause is whatever preponderates between two possible results. And that might be one reason why it's not so natural for him to think about teleology and final causation, because final causes don't really do that, right? Final causes are more like purposes or goals toward which the thing naturally drives. So I think that's my answer, but
Okay,
I'm less confident about that one.
Yeah, we've got 10 more minutes, and this is perhaps the last question. To what extent was Razi influenced by Sufi thought, and did he renounce dialectical kalam in favor of more experimental forms of knowledge later in his life?
Yeah.
I've got one more question myself.
Yeah, that's controversial, actually. So there are some scholars who see a lot of Sufism in his works. There's also scholars, including someone we had here in Munich, Michael Noble, who's worked on Razi's occult thought. So Razi wrote a work that's basically about magic and astrology, which is very controversial, how that would fit into his overall corpus, whether it's even really by him. If it is by him, like, how did he understand it to be taken? So that's quite difficult. So there's a lot of scholarly dispute about that. I mean, I've worked more on these works of philosophical theology, and they're really not Sufi at all. And the Matalib is basically the last thing he wrote. And I don't think there's any Sufism in it. So it's very much just technical Avicenna philosophy. It's possible that he's kind of got, so this is something that I get to mention Frank Ruffel again. Frank thinks that Razi sort of writes differently on different occasions, depending on what kind of book he's writing. So it's conceivable that he might have like Sufi books and Kalam books and philosophy books, right? And that he would take a different position amongst them. But I'm kind of waiting to be convinced that he is, in any sense, deeply interested in Sufism. I haven't ever seen a text that convinced me of that.
There's also one last question. Some authors have referenced Razi's treatise on the types of pleasure to assert that he expressed regret regarding his philosophical perspective. How do you evaluate this interpretation?
I mean, I think I guess I don't know about that idea about pleasure. So there's stories about him basically saying, well, everything is uncertain, all of my work is kind of, worthless because who knows in the end, right? But I would tend to think that that's like a later story that's trying to put a construction on him. I don't really buy that he said that, I guess. And it's the kind of thing they're always saying about people after they die, right? So I'd be skeptical about that.
Well, we have almost reached the end, and I would like first to thank you. And before I give you the final thanks, I would like to ask your opinion about the relevance of Razi for, let's say, Muslim animal rights activists.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one thing that maybe didn't come out so clearly from what I said is that in a way, what he's saying about animals is actually deeply Quranic. Because, I mean, why would he want animals to survive death? Like, what's in it for him to argue for that, even implicitly? Well, it's a long-standing idea in Kalam. So you find it in Kalam already before the time of Ibn Sina, both amongst Asharites and Mu'tazilites. There's a reason for this, which is that there are passages in the Quran that seem to imply that God cares about animals and cares what happens to them. So there's like a passage in the Quran that says something like, they are all nations and will be gathered to him.
Yeah.
Right. So that looks like it's saying that animals survive death. Right. So this is the kind of passage that they had in mind when they were talking about God giving an afterlife to animals. And I think that Fakhr al-Dīn's contribution here is to grapple with a philosophical position that denies the possibility of this and say, well, actually, by your own premises, oh, your background's back just at the last second. By your own premises, you should have to admit that animals survive death as well. So I think that animal rights activists, obviously something that you see them doing anyway is going straight back to the Quran, right?
Yes.
But I think it's maybe worth them knowing that actually there's a long history of people already in the classical, reformative, and medieval period, whatever you want to call it, who are their predecessors in that project, and that it really is something that has a very strong intellectual pedigree in the Islamic world. Maybe Fakhr al-Dīn is not, the person everyone wants to have on their side. He's kind of a controversial figure, but I don't think it would hurt.
There's also the idea of tasbih, the fact that all animals are praising God. So how could animals be praising God if they don't have any shu'ur or understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's something you see more in the work by Ikhwan as-Safa, this 10th century group of Platonists, who wrote this amazing work where animals try to get the king of the jinn to get the humans to leave them alone, right? And they make a big deal about that animals are praising God. That's not something you find. Maybe Fakhr al-Dīn alludes to that, but it's not something he makes a big deal about.
Well, it is in the Quran that all the
absolutely,
animals.
yeah. No, the Ikhwan didn't make that up, right? But they go on and on about it, so they really, play a lot on that idea.
Well, thank you all for coming. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Adamson for a fantastic presentation and beautiful exchange with our participants. Apologies to participants whose questions could not be read to Professor Adamson because of the time. We are out of time. We hope that Professor Adamson will join us again, perhaps in person. That would be fantastic to have him a guest here at our college. Thank you all for coming, and we'll end it at this point. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Bye.